There was once a young man called Guleesh who spent his whole life hopelessly scratching on a barren potato patch. One night, feeling very wretched, he went out in the moonlight and wandered up the hill behind his cottage. Soon he reached the ruins of an old fort, where he sat down and began to grumble out loud. "I wish I could get away from this stump and have adventure." No sooner had these words left his lips than the moon vanished behind a cloud, and there was an explosion of invisible voices and footsteps rushing past him. Guleesh leaped to his feet and followed the sound into the ruined fort, where all the voices shouted, "My horse! My bridle! My saddle!" The next minute he heard a loud whinnying and stamping, as if an invisible herd of horses had suddenly arrived. "Well," thought Guleesh, "since I've got nothing to lose, I may as well try to join in with whatever's happening." So he took a deep breath and brazenly repeated the strange incantation. "My horse, my bridle, my saddle!" Outside the clouds lifted, sending a shaft of moonlight through the window. Now Guleesh could see that a beautiful white horse was standing before him, wearing a bridle of pure gold and a saddle trimmed with silver. All around him were hundreds of shrunken, wizened fairy faces, all mounted on similar, though much smaller, steeds. They turned to Guleesh, and they all shouted at once, "Come on, help us, hurry!" Then, with a loud cry, they all went galloping out of the fort, just like an autumn wind. Guleesh hesitated for a moment, then he leaped onto his own horse's back and galloped after them. They dashed across farms and bogs, they hurtled past villages, mansions, and hills. Finally they halted on a deserted beach where great foam breakers were seething over the sand. "Up we go!" shouted all the fairies, and they all rose up into the air. "Up we go!" Guleesh shouted too, and rose up after them. Through the clouds they soared, over the churning sea, and suddenly they plummeted down to a strange country, and they landed before the gates of a magnificent palace. Pardon me for asking," said Guleesh breathlessly to the nearest fairy, "but could you tell me where we are?" "We're in France, of course," the little fellow answered. "This is the king's palace, and we've come to rescue his daughter. She's in a terrible state because she's getting married tonight to a neighboring king, who's old and ugly and cruel. She can't stand him. She's managed to postpone the wedding for 3 years, but now her father has put his foot down, and he's forcing her to go ahead with it. What luck you're here tonight. You can help us snatch her away." "What do you want me to do?" asked Guleesh. "Take her on your horse, and make sure she doesn't fall off," said the fairy. "Just carry her as far as the fort where you joined us, then we'll take over from there." There was no time for Guleesh to ask any more questions, for fairies were now dismounting and shouting, "Into the palace! Let's do it!" Guleesh followed suit. In an instant he found himself in a splendid hall, lit by 1,000 brilliant candles and warmed by a fire of outsized logs and a fireplace twice as wide as his whole cottage. Rows of long tables were laden with roasted meats, cakes brimming with honey and clotted cream, dishes of grapes and pomegranates, and enough flagons of wine for an entire army. Around this spread milled hundreds of nobles and gentlefolk dressed in rich silks and velvets, tapping their feet to the music of the trumpets and the drums. Guleesh felt ashamed to be around such splendor, until he realized that no one could see his rags, for he was now invisible too. He followed the fairies to the far end of the hall. Here was an altar set up with 2 bishops waiting behind it to conduct the wedding. A little way off stood the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. So beautiful, in fact, that though her face was streaked with tears because of his dreadful fate, Guleesh was overcome with love for her and vowed to do whatever he could to help her. As she shook with sobs, her father, the King of France, seized her hand and led her firmly towards the altar. However, they did not get far before one of the fairies stretched out an invisible foot and tripped them. The girl tripped over it, stumbled, and fell to the marble floor with a startled gasp. Courtiers rushed to her aid, but the fairies elbowed them aside and tossed a gossamer blanket over her, shouting, "Vanish!" And at once she did. The astonished guest screamed and poked helplessly at the empty air. Meanwhile, the invisible fairies carried the invisible princess out of the palace. Guleesh followed them outside, and he joined in the shout, "My horse, my bridle, my saddle!" The enchanted horse materialized at once, and Guleesh leaped onto his horse. The fairies lifted the king's daughter onto the saddle behind him. "Grab my waist and hold on tight, my dear," Guleesh called over his shoulder. She did just as she was told. They galloped off across the French countryside to the sea, then rose into the air, and at no time at all Guleesh saw the familiar rolling green landscape of Ireland beneath them, with the ruined fort coming back into view. "If I'm going to stop the fairies keeping her, I need to outwit them," he thought. So as soon as his horse's hoofs touched ground, he jumped from the saddle and unceremoniously hauled the King of France's daughter with him. Then he drew the sign of the cross over them and shouted, "I claim this lady for myself in the name of God." At these holy signs, a terrible shriek tore through the air. The next moment all the horses were transformed into brittle stems of hemlock and thistle. The fairies' faces puckered with fury and yelled, "You cheat, Guleesh, you thief! The lady's ours, give her back!" One of them stomped up to the King of France's daughter and slapped her hard on the side of the head. "You'll pay for this," he shrieked at Guleesh. "I've struck her dumb." Dawn was lightening the sky, and down in the valley a rooster crowed. The fairies shuddered and winced, sliding back towards the ruined fort, shimmering, fading, dissolving like night mist. And then, all at once, they were gone. Guleesh turned uncertainly towards the King of France's daughter. Never in his life had he been near such a fine lady before. Knowing it was not seemly to take her home to his humble cottage, with neither mother nor sister to act as chaperone, he offered, "Follow me, my dear, for I know an upright person who will take care of you." The King of France's daughter, though now unable to speak, smiled and nodded to show her gratitude. Guleesh helped her down the steep, stony path from the fort, past his cottage to the village, and along the main street to the priest's house. The kindly priest was astonished, but on hearing their strange adventure with the fairies, he willingly agreed to give her sanctuary and lodging. Guleesh visited her there every night. Although the fairy curse made conversation impossible, they got along very well with eyes, smiles, and what have you. The love that Guleesh had felt as soon as he laid eyes upon her grew in intensity, and it was not long before she returned it. The priest insisted that she write to her father, saying that she was safe, but months passed with no reply, indicating that her father had washed his hands of her, which of course was a great relief. Thus everything went very well, except that the poor lady still could not speak. Since the fairies were the cause of this affliction, Guleesh guessed that they might hold the key to a cure. So whenever he wasn't courting the King of France's daughter or working his potato patch, he hung around the ruined fort, hoping for another sight of the fairies. At last, on the night of Halloween, he heard a flurry of voices and footsteps on the wind. Guleesh threw himself onto the grass and lay very still as the fairies rushed past him. Then he crawled after them into the ruin, cocking his ear. Amongst the babble of chatter and cackle of laughter, he was rewarded by overhearing the following conversation. "That stupid mortal thought he'd get the better of us, but the lady can't even talk. He thinks she's cursed forever. Why doesn't the fool realize that a simple elixir of that 7-branched herb growing by his own front door would easily cure her?" Guleesh did not wait to hear any more. He slipped away, raced back to his cottage, and felt around the doorstep in the dark. There, amongst the coarse grass, his fingers closed upon a tall plant that he had never noticed before. He pulled it up and took it inside, and by the dim light of his single lamp, he confirmed that it had 7 branches. He lit his modest fire, boiled up the kettle, squeezed out the herb's white sap, and stirred it in the water. Once it was thoroughly brewed, he tasted a little. When he was certain it had not poisoned him, he carried it to the priest's house and gave it to the King of France's daughter to drink. Within a few moments of swallowing it, sure enough, she began to speak. First she thanked him for rescuing her from the forced marriage and the clutches of the fairies. She also thanked him for being such a gentleman and ensuring that her honor stayed intact. She began to tell him all about herself and her life in the French palace, what her hobbies were, who her friends used to be, how her dear mother was long dead and her father had treated her callously for as long as she could remember. She talked about what she liked for dinner, what her favorite colors and tunes and flowers were, and so on and so on and so on, so that by the time she stopped to draw a breath, Guleesh felt as if he had known her forever. He, in turn, told her briefly and frankly that he had loved her with all his heart, and he begged her to forsake her royal origins and accept him as her humble husband. "Oh, Guleesh," she cried, "I love you too, and I accept your proposal most willingly." Since the priest was quite handy, they arranged the wedding straight away. By all accounts, those shifty fairies never troubled them again, and they lived happily ever after.